The dog-headed Nephilim and Alexander the Great, serious evidence and suspicions that their descendants are among us today. The dog-headed Nephilim, called Cynocephali, meaning that their faces looked almost like a dog's. Anyone who sees the true story and how the acts along with the two-footed serpents who led the first and blame their victims for what they have done and are themselves to cover up the shame, as any unscrupulous does, just as the opposite of them. Now, the fact that the masses are used to them because they have been among us since childhood does not make them normal, and they were the first ones we noticed on the large scale in 2014 from their unnatural behavior, and others that have been on the internet since they were very young, seeing everything as normal. And these are the elements that distinguish people from others. They could work completely mechanically throughout their lives. Now, as Houston Stewart Chamberlain rightly said, from the smallest things to the biggest, regardless of their position and how many degrees they have, these people work as a herd in all areas, as you learn from them from childhood. And therefore, they do not change if you teach them a doctrine. Whatever you say to these people, you are wasting your time. So they're incapable of making new inventions or inventions, since they are based on what we're taught only and nothing else. Now, a well-known version of Callisthenes' novel, The Tale of Alexander, meaning Alexander the Great, which we know also as Phila the Alexander the Great, the subject to which I referred to in related articles, the writer says, the encounter of the soldier with the dog-faced is mentioned. The Nephilim. Now we know that Alexander the Great went towards the east. He was supposed to meet an Atlantean extraterrestrial in the Taklamakan Desert to receive a secret, highly advanced weapon, which supposedly he did. It was supposed to enable you to switch from material existence to another dimension. Now, during his encounters with various peoples of the East, he had chroniclers describing what he was witnessing, and one of the things he witnessed were the abominable races. He called them abominable because they were different from regular humans. They were part human, part animal. Now, from this subject to referring from what the writer refers to, from this day, 10 days ago, in a place where the dog-headed were, the chronicler said, their bodies were human, their heads were dogs, and their voices were human, and they walked like dogs. Alexander killed many of them, and after 10 days leaving their place, he went to a village. The chronicler wrote, this brief mention is apparently not enough to justify the extent of the presence of the canine heads in later times and their strong influence on Byzantine iconography and Christianity in general. And as it seems, however, Alexander's novel had another much greater penetrating ability and was not just another Greek novel among the many others of the Hellenistic era. Alexander the Great, as we know, lived around 330 BC. Now, this extreme mythologization and acceptance of Alexander the Great did not happen immediately, of course. With each passing century from his death onwards, he accumulated material of fiction and fantasy to such an extent that the myth was always alive and until recently. Of course, the process of mythologizing Alexander is not so easily explained, but rather we have to start things from the beginning and see the issue as its origin. All historians, researchers, and scholars of literature today accept the opinion that the literary genre we know as the novel is a Greek contribution to world literature, and this was invented in Greece during the Hellenistic period of Alexander the Great, 330 BC, not under the name novel, but under the name dramatic discourse. Patriarch Photius preserves this view in his famous library. Works of similar form were still called drama, books, or book, while in the medieval period we know them as short stories. So clearly the name novel is much later. Thomas Hagg, in his wonderful work, notes the following. The word mythistoria first appeared in Latin texts of the 4th century AD to denote biographies contained trivial facts or lies mixed with truths. This term was proposed by Corais in 1804 for the ancient Greek novel instead of the barbarous romance which he himself renders Romanon, with the following argument. He said, I consider myth history to be a short and appropriate name, which not only it actively means the nature of the thing, but it is also a word, therefore very Hellenic. Now, from the previous classification, we see that the novel of Alexander belongs to the novels of that time, composed several centuries after the death of the soldier, Alexander the Great, that is, by an anonymous author of 300 AD, because the work was wrongly attributed to the historian Callisthenes from Olynthos, who accompanied Alexander on his campaigns. We call it the author of Callisthenes, and the original attribution of the work to the historian Callisthenes was made by the Byzantine scholar Yanis Tsetsis in the 12th century, and we meet it again in various manuscripts of the work of the 14th and 15th centuries. We still know it as the Tale of Alexander the Great, or the Myth of Alexander, or the Life of Alexander the Great, names and actions. And finally, we know that it was Callisthenes because of what had been mentioned. Another name for the work, a Byzantine prose adaptation, because there are metered adaptations as well. In other words, it goes by meter, pentameter, is entitled History of Alexander the Great, His Life, Wars, and Death, and was printed as a book in Venice in 1699, with several later reprints. This adaptation is the most well known. It was circulated in a cheap edition in shoddy pamphlets and became known as the popular expression Filada of Alexander the Great, from the pamphlet of Alexander the Great. From what I know, I think this pamphlet is the most common form of telling the adventures of Alexander. Despite the monstrous untruths and mostly fantastic descriptions of the play, its author, Callisthenes, also known as Aesop, revealed somewhere to tell his fable. He used some models, Aesop fables, right? Of course, he used the work of the historian Callisthenes' Acts of Alexander, which was left incomplete due to the death of the author. The work includes a geographical description of the countries of Asia Minor, Syria, Phoenicia, etc., through which Alexander passed, without quoting historical exaggerations and fictions, given that, as Alexander's historiographer, he was clearly accurate and not at all a joker. Precisely because he did not belong to the sycophants who surrounded Alexander, he fell out of favor with him, so as a historical source it was valuable. Another source of Callisthenes was the Vasili Ephemerides, which were compiled in the chief secretary of the court, a procedure that was in accordance with the customs of the Persian court, and we assume that the Vasilian papers, the kingly papers that is, were the official collection of information relating to the state and kingship in general, despite the fact that the word papers means something quite sketchy. I can't imagine any other use for them other than as an official record of the kingdom, unless they were a form of newspaper, handwritten of course, that was posted on the walls of the palace and had various news. A third and final source for Callisthenes must have been Ptolemy, the first historian of Alexander the Great, who so exploited the Alexander myth to establish his position on the throne of Egypt. Angelos Furiotis notes. The Ptolemy era started with one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy I. Now, it's not improbable that his story, the work of Ptolemy I, formed a basis for the copies and circulated in the 2nd century AD, which may have formed the basis of the variant of the 3rd century AD. The second variant must have been made in the 2nd century AD because a key element favors its composition at the time, the insertion within the novel of the hero's campaign in Italy and the conquest of Rome. This is an indirect revenge of the author against the Roman occupation. As for the complete composition of the entire novel, this is the work of 3rd century AD, as shown by the commemoration of the philosopher Favorins, the multitude of Asiatic emperors of Rome named Alexander, the chronology of the myths and traditions about Alexander, the verses inserted in the novel and the survivals of it, Ptolemaic elements and elements of the 2nd century AD, with mainly the interpolation of letters, Alexander to Aristotle, who was his teacher, as we know, and Olympias, who was his mother, and correspondence, Alexander Didymos, king of the Brahmins of India, the Hindus, a means to make the narratives more popular and more rich in action, as was customary during the imperial Roman years. The quotation or integration of the various letters in the life of Alexander is, according to scholars, a remarkable innovation. On the one hand, it gives the opportunity to highlight the personality of the letter writer and to make clear the subjective ability to judge, to give the perspectives from which he evaluated the various events, and on the other hand, to consolidate the degree of objectivity of what is described so that they can be considered as real. And it's not reality. And it's no coincidence that precisely in this unrestrained correspondence are contained most of the fictional elements of the work. A rich, unbridled imagination that leaves nothing to be desired. He takes advantage of every event, everything known to the author, everything he has come across or heard or read. So this novel is a mixture of historical truth and fantasy. These two elements are so inseparable, so firmly integrated into each other that it takes great effort to separate them. In the tradition of Alexander's contact with the dog-headed Nephilim, there is a folkloric reference from Romania, and it's inserted from the point of view of the dimension and also the distortion of the myth. Quote, God sent Alexander the Great to punish the wicked. When Alexander defeated King Porus, he seized him and imprisoned him in the dark hollows of a hill range which enclosed the dog heads, and from there Porus can only come out in the following weather. On top of these hills, Alexander the Great planted a fork and put a bell on it that rings with the blowing of the wind. The dog-headed people, when they hear the bell, know that Alexander is there guarding them. They will come out in the next time and begin the work that God intended for them. Bullheads have one eye in the forehead and one in the back of the neck. They are violent and extremely evil Nephilim. Their speech is bad. They catch people and after fattening them, bake them in the oven and eat them. The next tradition says the same thing. The wind moves the ships on the seas and cleans the atmosphere of evil. It also rings the bell which Alexander the Great placed above the hills, where the dog-headed Nephilim, the abominable race, are locked up, which will come out after many ages. These two traditions, which clearly belong to the cycle about Alexander the Great, present a new version. They invade the whole story of the one-eyed man-eating Cyclops, the so-called Monomatides, while a one-eyed dragon is mentioned in the tale from Kerasunda. Three-eyed beings known as the Triamata are also spoken of or hinted at, and are also related to the Cyclops according to popular lore. As Ansbacher argues, the myth of the dog-headed Nephilim also exists in Arabic literature, which is evident in the work of the Arab scholar Al-Qazwini, who refers to a race of dog-headed Nephilim that had the face of a dog, the body of a human, and wings, a variant of the myth that we do not find anywhere else. A second variant calls for two-bodied canine heads, and there are related depictions of them in the works of Wolfhard and Aldrovandi, as beings with a double physical appearance, human and dog. The dog-headed Nephilim, the Cynocephali, appear mainly among the Slavic people, where popular philology considers them cannibals, and sometimes they were identified with the Tartars. And in Greece, we have related reports, as Economides mentions, quote, in northern Greece and Thrace, they say that dog-headed people are people from the front and dogs from the back. They talk from the front and bark from the back. They pet you from the front and they eat you from the back. In the Spartan legends, it said that they dwell beyond Burlian and 8 people. In Greek fairy tales, the dog-headed Nephilim are similar to dragons, which the fairy tale hero fights and becomes master of these treasures. The Sikieneza of the Albanians, the Psoglavi of the Bulgarians, and the Kapkani or Katsuni of the Romanians are similar to these hounds. So to get a more general Balkan idea of hounds, I suppose that in rough lines, this is an overall outline of the historical problem concerning dog-headed creatures, at least until the end of the Middle Ages, when again we have a peculiar surge of information on the subject. As I've already mentioned, the writer says, apart from Oderic and Paderna, the Franciscan friar, who others call Oderico of Pordenone, the same theories were also advocated by John Mandeville, who, while the whole story referring to monstrous people, was reinforced by discoveries and explorations in the 15th century. But as the boundaries of the known world expanded due to these very exploratory voyages, rumors of the existence of a race of dog-headed people receded, and information was relegated to the mythological past. Apparently, this mythological past survived through another process, the presence in Christian history and iconography of a dog-headed looking saint, Saint Christopher, the patron saint of motorists. How did this completely paradoxical phenomenon happen? When Christianity was established as the official religion of the Eastern Roman state, which we know as Byzantium, especially from the 4th to 6th centuries AD, the so-called pagans, the Gentiles, and the Greek Olympian god believers suffered severe persecution, and their religion was banned, at least officially, because secretly they survived for many more centuries. And not only did it survive, but it pierced popular beliefs about Christianity and saints by inoculating them with various pagan customs such as swallow stoning, etc. And at the level of art, among others, this was realized mainly with the presence of canine heads of Saint Christopher, a unique, in the sense of paradoxical, characteristic of Byzantine art, as thoroughly presented in a related work by Hoxha. And this is according to Ancient Mysteries. I've translated this from a Greek article. From what I had read on my own, there were priests that had advised people not to marry those who had their profile, their face profile, showing that the bottom part from their nose to their chin was extended more than the forehead, because they were descendants of these canine-headed Nephilim creatures. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.